He stole $23 million from Google, then went back and stole again. 2 years later, he turned to Facebook and walked away with tens of millions more. In total, more than $120 million left some of the most powerful corporations on Earth, and for a long time, nobody noticed. There were no emergency meetings, and no systems went offline. Executives were not alerted, and nothing about the transactions suggested a crisis. The payments were approved through standard channels. The invoices were processed as routine paperwork, and the wires were sent without hesitation. On paper, everything was normal, which is why nothing felt wrong. The money moved the way it was designed to move, quietly, legitimately, and without resistance. The man responsible was Evaldas Rimasauskas. He wasn't an insider, he wasn't a hacker, he didn't breach servers or exploit software flaws, he didn't need access to Google's systems or Facebook's databases. He never broke in, he simply asked to be paid. For years, the scheme worked, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was familiar. The companies trusted the names on the invoices. They trusted the relationships behind them. They trusted the routine, and that trust allowed millions of dollars to disappear without triggering suspicion. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the money was already gone, scattered across countries and accounts that could not be easily traced. What followed was not just a criminal case, but a revelation that the greatest vulnerability in modern institutions is not technology, but assumptions. This is the story of how one ordinary man exploited that weakness, and how easily it worked. Evaldas Rimasauskas did not look like the kind of man who would one day be accused of pulling off one of the most embarrassing financial frauds in corporate history. Born and raised in Lithuania, he lived a life that was unremarkable in every visible way. He was married for more than 2 decades, ran a construction business at one point, and blended easily into the background of ordinary European middle age. He had no criminal record, no reputation for dishonesty, and no technical expertise that would suggest a future in cybercrime. He was the kind of man nobody was watching, because there was no reason to. For years, his life followed a quiet, predictable path. There were no signs of excess, no sudden wealth, no outward instability. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared settled, even dull. But beneath that surface, something was slowly unraveling. Evaldas and his wife had spent years trying to have children, each failure compounding the last. When they were finally told that in vitro fertilization was their only real option, the cost placed it firmly out of reach. What should have been a medical decision became a financial wall, and that wall began to close in on him. The disappointment hardened into depression. The depression fed into alcohol. Drinking escalated until blackouts became routine. Moments of lost time where he could not recognize the person he had become, or even, at times, the woman beside him. His marriage strained under the weight of grief that had no outlet and no resolution. This was not the image of a criminal plotting a grand scheme. It was the portrait of a man losing control of his life in slow motion. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because this is not how crime usually announces itself. There was no hunger for power, no obsession with wealth, no grand ideology. What pushed Evaldas forward was not ambition, but desperation. The quiet, corrosive kind that grows when ordinary life collapses and no one is paying attention. By the early 2000s, Lithuania had earned an uncomfortable reputation across Europe. It was not defined by violence or large-scale organized crime, but by something quieter and more transactional: car theft rings. Vehicles disappeared in Western Europe and re-emerged as dismantled parts within days, shipped east, resold piece by piece, and absorbed into legitimate markets as if nothing had happened. For a time it was lucrative. The risk felt manageable. The system worked. This was the environment in which Evaldas began to think differently. If crime was going to be worth the risk, it needed to attract less attention and generate far more money. Stealing physical objects was noisy. Someone always noticed when their car disappeared. Someone always called the police. The act itself triggered an alarm, so he reframed the problem. The question was no longer how to take something valuable, but how to take it without the victim immediately realizing anything was missing. Where did money leave organizations quietly, as part of routine, without panic or urgency? The answer was not in their technology. It was not in their servers, their databases, or their security infrastructure. Those systems were built to be defended, audited, and attacked. Entire departments existed solely to protect them. The blind spot was far more mundane. It was accounting, vendors, invoices. Money flowed out of companies every day, approved by small groups of people following established relationships and familiar names. Payments that looked routine were treated as a daily routine. And in that space, where trust replaced scrutiny, Evaldas found exactly what he was looking for. He did not invent a new identity. He borrowed one that already carried weight. The company was Quanta Computer. It was a real manufacturer, enormous in scale, deeply embedded in the global technology supply chain. Quanta built the hardware that powered the modern internet, quietly supplying servers and infrastructure to the biggest companies in the world. It worked with Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Cisco. Invoices from Quanta were not unusual. They were expected. They were routine. They passed through finance departments without triggering alarms, because they always had. That was the brilliance of the choice. Evaldas did not need to convince anyone that Quanta existed. Everyone already knew it did. All he had to do was step into the space between expectation and verification. He began by creating a duplicate that looked legitimate enough to survive a cursory glance. A company bearing Quanta's name was registered in Latvia with a declared capital of exactly €1. On paper, it was real. That was all the system required. With that registration, he opened legitimate European Union bank accounts that carried none of the red flags associated with offshore secrecy or shell corporations in distant jurisdictions. Everything sat comfortably within the boundaries of normal business. Then came the details. Contracts were drafted to mirror real agreements. Corporate seals were forged. Letterheads were recreated down to spacing and formatting. Email addresses were set up to resemble official Quanta domains, closely enough that no one felt the need to question them. When messages arrived, they looked like thousands of others that had already been approved over the years. The language was professional. The tone was familiar. Nothing felt urgent or strange. That was the point. The illusion did not rely on perfection, only plausibility. It did not need to survive a forensic investigation, only the casual confidence of people doing their jobs. And because every element matched what recipients already expected to see, no one stopped to ask whether it should be verified at all. Everything looked right, because most of it was. In 2013, the first test of the scheme began. The emails were sent carefully, structured to look no different from the countless vendor communications that moved through corporate inboxes every day. Attached were invoices that appeared routine, accompanied by wiring instructions that matched the tone and formatting of previous transactions. Nothing about them suggested urgency or deception. They simply asked to be paid. Inside Google, the requests were processed the way such requests always were. Verification calls were made, but they led nowhere unusual. The responses confirmed what the paperwork already suggested. To the people handling the transaction, this was just another administrative task in a system built to move billions of dollars efficiently. The payment details on file were updated, and the process continued. Then the money moved. The transfers went through quietly. Without resistance or delay, millions of dollars left Google's accounts exactly as they were supposed to, directed to bank accounts that appeared legitimate and properly documented. Over time, the total reached $23 million. No alarms sounded, no investigations were triggered, nothing broke. From the outside, the system had worked exactly as designed. What made the moment extraordinary was not the amount of money, but the absence of reaction. $23 million was generational wealth by any ordinary standard. For Evaldas, it could have been an ending. He could have disappeared, taken what he had, and closed the door on the entire operation. He didn't. The ease of it changed the calculation. If the largest technology company in the world could be fooled once, it could be fooled again. And if this much money could move without consequence, then stopping now no longer made sense. He did not treat the first success as a narrow escape. Instead, he did what the system itself seemed to invite him to do. He repeated the scam. The same emails, the same tone, the same paperwork. Again and then again. The target did not change because it did not need to. The method did not evolve because it was already working. Each new invoice blended into the last. Each payment looked like a continuation of an existing relationship, rather than a new request. By 2015, the operation had matured. The process was familiar, the risks felt manageable, and the system had already proven how much it was willing to give without resistance. The setup did not need to change. Only the target did. This time, the focus shifted to Meta. Like Google, it was deeply embedded in Quanta Computer's ecosystem, accustomed to large payments and conditioned to trust long-standing vendors. The same structure was reused, the same style of emails, the same types of invoices, the same supporting documents designed to blend seamlessly into normal operations. Nothing about the requests appeared extraordinary, except the size. The ambition was larger now. Invoices worth millions were sent repeatedly, each one framed as a routine settlement for goods and services already rendered. The first transfers went through. $26 million moved out of Facebook's accounts and into the network of banks prepared to receive it. For a brief moment, it looked like the scheme would scale exactly as before. Then something changed. A larger payment raised questions that the smaller ones had not. The numbers crossed a threshold where routine became uncomfortable. Scrutiny arrived late, but it arrived. $74 million was flagged before it could disappear, stopped by internal review processes that had finally caught up with what was happening. The money that had already moved was gone, but the silence was broken. And for the first time since the scheme began, the people on the other side of the transaction understood that they were not paying a trusted partner at all. As soon as the money arrived, it did not stay still. The accounts that received the funds were never meant to hold them for long. Within moments, the transfers were broken apart and sent onward, routed through banks in Latvia, Cyprus, Slovakia, Lithuania, Hungary, and Hong Kong. Each transaction moved the money farther from its point of origin, splintering it across jurisdictions with different laws, different regulators, and different speeds of cooperation. The faster the money moved, the harder it became to recover. Every additional transfer added delay, paperwork, and uncertainty. By the time one bank froze an account, the funds had already passed through several others. And yet, amid all this movement, Evaldas himself did not move at all. He stayed in Lithuania. He did not flee to a country without extradition. He did not disappear under a new identity. He did not act like someone who believed the hunt would ever reach him. In his mind, the dispersion of the money was enough. If the funds were untraceable, then he would be untouchable. That assumption was his mistake. Money can be fragmented, but responsibility cannot. While the trail grew complex, it never stopped leading back to the same place. And unlike the money, he had left himself exactly where investigators expected to find him. By March of 2017, the search was no longer theoretical. Lithuanian authorities moved first, arresting Evaldas Rimasauskas on his return home. There was no attempt to flee, no confrontation, no denial that held up under scrutiny. Within months, he was extradited to the United States, where federal prosecutors laid out the charges with clinical precision: wire fraud, money laundering, and identity fraud. The case did not unfold in a crowded courtroom or drag on through a public trial. Evaldas pleaded guilty. The facts were too clean, the paper trail too intact. There was no spectacle, only admission. As the case moved towards sentencing, an uncomfortable detail began to surface. Despite the scale of the theft, Evaldas himself had not lived like someone who had touched tens of millions of dollars. Investigators found that he had personally kept only around $100,000. The rest of the money had vanished into accounts and hands that were never conclusively identified. No accomplices were charged. No higher figures were named. The largest sums simply disappeared. Prosecutors hinted at a possibility they could not fully prove: that Evaldas was not the architect of the operation. He may have been the face rather than the mind. The man whose European Union citizenship allowed him to open bank accounts, register companies, and move money with minimal friction. In this version of the story, his role was functional rather than strategic. If that theory is true, then Evaldas was never meant to be the one who escaped. He was a frontman, an account opener, a point of access to the European banking system, a disposable operator. The real architects, whoever they were, left no names behind and no trails that could be followed with certainty. When the net closed, it closed around the one person who was visible enough to catch, while the rest of the operation slipped quietly out of reach. In 2019, the case reached its conclusion. Evaldas Rimasauskas was sentenced to 5 years in a United States federal prison. The court ordered the forfeiture of roughly $49 million and imposed restitution of approximately $26 million more. On paper, it looked decisive. In reality, tens of millions of dollars remained unaccounted for, scattered beyond recovery, absorbed into systems designed to forget where money has been. The sentence itself raised an uncomfortable comparison. 5 years was a finite cost. The missing money represented a sum that most people would never see in a lifetime. For many observers, the math felt unsettlingly simple. Plenty of people, given the choice, would trade half a decade of freedom for $40 million, and a place in history as the man who outwitted the world's largest tech companies.